Hi, welcome back everybody to today's webinar titled What We Heard, Improvements to Drug Reimbursement Reviews. This is a follow-up to our December 17th webinar in which we introduced some proposed changes to Canada's Drug Agency's Pharmaceutical Reviews. This was followed by a written consultation period from January 6th until February 6th. So my name's Sam Sutherland, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm an engagement officer here at Canada's Drug Agency. Bienvenue à tous à notre webinaire intitulé Les améliorations processus d'examen en vue du remboursement, résultats des consultations. Je m'appelle Samuel Sutherland, mes pronoms sont il, lui, et je suis un agent de mobilisation ici à l'Agence des médicaments du Canada. Le webinaire aujourd'hui sera en anglais, mais je voulais simplement dire un petit bonjour à nos participants francophones. So as we give it a moment for more folks to arrive, I'll just go through a few housekeeping items. So today's presentation is being recorded. It will be posted to our YouTube channel, and later this week or early next week, we'll be sending out the link to this recording to all those that registered. We will have time for several questions from the audience. So you can submit some questions at any time by clicking on the little ribbon with the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're so fortunate to have had so much interest in this work. We received a significant amount of feedback, 56 submissions, including 26 patient group submissions. So we're so thankful for the time and effort and thoughtful responses that we received during this process. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining this webinar from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. To acknowledge the land, we must recognize the Indigenous people's long-standing presence in this territory and how their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. So wherever you're joining the meeting from today, I just encourage you to think about the land in which you live and work and give thanks to the Indigenous people who have lived here long before us and who still do, and that have and continue to sustain and protect the land that we call home. I'd invite you all to share where you're joining us from in the chat box. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, my name's Sam, so I'll be your host for the session. We have three amazing speakers joining us today. So we'll have some opening remarks from Sudha Kuddy, our Executive Vice President of Evidence, Products and Services, followed by Peter Dyrda, our Director of Pharmaceutical Reviews, and finally Michelle Gibbens, our Director of Engagement. Next slide, please. In terms of the agenda for the day, so we're going to provide a brief overview of the Pharmaceutical Reviews Renewal Initiative. We're going to outline some key aspects of what we proposed, describe what we heard, and discuss where we landed as well. Like I mentioned, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer period. And so Michelle and Peter will be able to answer some questions after each of their respective presentations today. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to our guest, Sudha Kuddy, for a few remarks, and then we'll pass it over to Peter.
Thanks so much, Sam. And thank you so much to all of you for joining today. I just really have a few seconds of remarks. There's a lot to convey in today's webinar, and I really want to make sure that Peter and Michelle have enough time and that you all have enough time to ask questions. So firstly, thank you for your interest in joining today, and thank you to all of you who took the time to provide feedback. It's not lost on us that so many of you spent so much time reviewing our documentation and sort of sharing your thoughts on what we're proposing. I would ask you to consider today and consider all of this as really the beginning of a journey, right? We're starting to change the pharmaceutical review program, and this is really the first step in that journey. Much of the feedback that we received, and Peter's going to go over this, really focused on us going bigger or on us being bolder in what we're proposing, and we will get there. But I often say to our team, we need to walk before we run. And so please keep that in mind throughout the course of this webinar. This is really the start of something. It's the start of something I'm hoping very innovative and very creative as we continue to look at how do we continually improve the work that we do. But would just ask you to sort of bear that in mind throughout the course of today. And so I think with those words, just a few high-level words, I'm just going to turn it over now to Peter to really start off with the content. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sudha. Appreciate you coming on as well. So I'm going to first start with just a level setting with what it actually was. When I say it, I mean the Pharmaceutical Reviews renewal. What some of the details were around that initiative, just so that for those of you who may be somewhat familiar but not familiar with everything. So really starting at a very high level view, just looking at our process in terms of reimbursement reviews, specifically for drug reviews. So if you follow from left to right, we really start with the evidence that gets submitted to us. And then we look at our reviews as sort of three phases: inputs, throughputs, and outputs. So the inputs that go into the review are the CDA reviewer reports. So that's our staff that takes the evidence from sponsors and critically appraises it for the committee. Also looking at some of the clinician and patient input that sort of helps feed into that. Once we have that piece done, the throughput is the expert committee, whether that's CDEC or PERC, deliberating upon the evidence to reach a conclusion. And that conclusion is in the form of a recommendation to payers. So once that is concluded, we put that together in our outputs, which are our recommendation reports and our review reports, which we then post for transparency. So it's these three phases of the review process that we sort of focus on, and in all three phases, we've looked at making improvements. So what are the goals for Pharmaceutical Reviews Renewal, or PR renewal for short? Really simple. We wanted to modernize our program, and we continue to want to modernize it to adapt to the changing needs of the health system. So it's really about how do we help improve dialogue and transparency and the usefulness of our outputs, maximizing sort of the utility of our work. We want to enable a proportionate approach to drug reviews. So we want to make sure that we allocate resources accordingly to the complexity of the files. And I think we've really gone about reorganizing our inputs to do that. And then, of course, we'd like to be part of the solution for accelerated access. So we understand that the work we do is on the continuum of reimbursement. So how can we help the system move a bit faster to get access for patients? And so there's a couple initiatives that we're undertaking to accomplish that as well. So these are the 5 areas of focus. If you'll recall, some of the document we posted, if you were part of the written consultation, was divided in these 5 areas. So looking at proportionate reviews, our reports, deliberations, accelerated access pathways, and then checkpoints with sponsors throughout the process. And so these are how all those 5 priorities sort of fit in within our inputs, throughputs, and outputs. So if you follow again from left to right, we start with the drug for review. We have now looked at expanding our checkpoints. So we've split our pre-submission meeting into 2. There's a traditional pre-sub meeting, which we've sort of altered, and then an evidence presentation meeting or checkpoint that is new. We've also added some in-review checkpoints and formalized some, as well as some post-review checkpoints. So we've brought that number up to 5 for each review, again, in the spirit of increasing dialogue and transparency. As far as proportionate reviews, so we've really looked at expanding some of our tailored reviews and redefining complex reviews. For deliberations, we've refreshed our deliberative framework and published a recommendation pathway, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then our report refresh. So this is maybe the piece you haven't had as much insight to yet, but you'll see once we start to publish reports stemming from this process, you'll see that they're a lot more concise, a little bit more clear. And a term that Suda likes to use is snazzified. So a little bit more appealing and easier to read. And then, of course, at the bottom, you have your accelerated access pathways. So there's time-limited recommendations, or TLR, target 0 with rolling reviews, and then PACES reviews, which are a new type of tailored review that we've introduced through this process. So that is the crash course to PR renewal. A timeline reminder. So just recall that the changes that with these new processes and procedures will apply to files that are targeting the October CDEC and PERC meetings. So what does that mean? It means that files that are submitted on or after April 28th for oncology and May 12th for non-oncology will be subject to these procedures. Anything that's submitted prior to those dates is subject to our current procedures. And recall that there's an advance notification of 30 days. So those advance notifications actually have to go in on April 8th and 23rd, respectively. So just some housekeeping. PACES reviews, also important that we will begin accepting advance notifications with those same timelines. So if you have an oncology PACES review, if you're a sponsor, or non-oncology review, we would expect that those advance notifications come in April. There's some questions around the fee schedules, particularly for PACES. So we tend to update our fee schedule every year in the March Pharmaceutical Review update, which will be the last Thursday of this month. We tend to update it annually to see if there's any changes. So we will publish the official PACES schedule, which is Schedule B. But for planning purposes, so that you're aware, it's 90% of the fee of a Schedule A. Okay. So a little bit of a pitch for PACES to remind sponsors. This is a tailored review for pharmaceuticals with anticipated comparable efficacy and safety. So recall, this is intended for simple low-risk files where a claim of clinical benefit is not made. And so we've had some interest from a few sponsors already. So we are expecting to have a few files come through in April. We've also had some sponsors who have reached out to us with some reluctance, particularly around some of the discussion about the clinical benefit claim. So we could talk a little bit about that later. There's a slide to sort of address some of that, but I don't want manufacturers to be discouraged by the language that we're using there. The intent of it is just to have plain language. Timelines, let's recall, part of the reason to do PACES, it's an accelerated access pathway. So we are going to be reviewing these in 100 to 120 days versus 180 days. So we are going to be shaving 60 to 80 days from these. And of course, we are part of the continuum, but after a recommendation leaves our doors, it goes to PCPA. And so PCPA will be communicating their corresponding process for PACES reviews imminently. And so we are hoping to potentially have someone from PCPA provide us a statement. So we were lucky enough that they did. So this is a word from PCPA on PACES reviews. Okay, so I'm quoting here. I'll just read it out. The PCPA has been actively involved in the PACES discussions or development with their partner, us. Similar to the TLR PTAP continuum, they will have a negotiation pathway for this. They understand the need for a negotiation pathway that is aligned with PACES and for the process to be smooth and seamless for manufacturers, CDA, and PCPA. And they're looking forward to sharing more on this shortly. And in the meantime, manufacturers can reach out directly to PCPA if they have any questions. Okay, so that's obviously we're excited about this. Just like we partnered on the TLR PTAP continuum, we look forward to partnering with them on the PACES continuum as well to sort of demonstrate that collaboration in getting accelerated access. So for the bulk of our discussion today, we're going to be talking about the post-consultation conclusions. So just a quick overview of the consultation process. So we received 56 submissions of written feedback during the Jan 6 to Feb 6 period, which I don't know for a fact, but I know it to be true that is a record. So thank you all, and echoing what Sudha said, it is great to get all your engagement, and hopefully we'd love to get some feedback on the feedback process with us trying to sort of limit it instead of one large document, publishing separate documents so that you can sort of pick and choose which components you can spend your time on. So here are the types of groups we received input from. So quite a bit from pharmaceutical companies, the most from patient groups, 26, one clinician group, public drug plans, and even an academic. And then, of course, we had several roundtables with various patient groups and industry associations in the back half of last year and early on this year. So thank you all again for taking the time to do that. It was very valuable. So in terms of the themes for the discussion today, we've got these 8 themes in no particular order. These are sort of the 8 themes we wanted to pull out. And what we wanted to do, the format of this going forward is we're going to tell you what we proposed, what we heard from the consultation, and then where we've landed. Because I don't think I've mentioned to this point, but the update to the procedures were posted last Thursday. So you can actually go in and see online now where we've landed with the documents. So we wanted to give folks a bit of time to be able to digest those before this webinar. But we'll summarize, again, some of the key themes. And if we haven't hit on the theme you're most interested in, or if you have any questions, we'll pause after to take quite a bit of time for a Q&A. All right. So the first topic, submission components. So this one's probably a bit more geared towards sponsors. So the first part of submission components was around streamlining application requirements. So we had a list of, I think, 5 or 6 different requirements that we have moved to discontinue. And so what we heard, not surprisingly, was some suggestions for removing other application requirements as well and discontinuing them. I just wanted to say we appreciated the thought that went into that and the rationale. We reviewed every single one that went through, and ultimately the team decided that there was still an important need in some respects for the suggestions that we received. So we didn't add any additional requirements to this discontinued list. Mind you, it's a fluid process and we're still adapting for the future, so that obviously is not permanent, but at this stage, we're continuing with just those requirements we proposed. The next part was around clinical expert suggestions. So we proposed that we would ask sponsors to provide us with a list of clinical experts that we could use in our reviews, and that we would aim as best as we could to include one expert from that list as part of our review. So recall, we need at least one clinical expert for a standard or PACES review or tailored review, more so for complex reviews, 3 to 5 in that case. So we'll try to at least take one, and we are aiming to have 2 clinical experts for every review as much as we can. And so I think that was received quite positively. So most of what we heard was just some requests for clarity around, if we have a list of clinicians, what would be considered a conflict of interest for them? There was also some questions from patient groups to say, hey, well, can we provide you with a list of clinicians? And so where we landed is we will be sharing, our conflict of interest form so people can see what we're looking for. But, generally, I wouldn't want to discourage any clinical experts from not submitting or applying to be an expert because of their conflicts. For the most part, conflicts are usually more about just being transparent with the committee than precluding participation. There's obviously exceptions, but generally we don't want to discourage. So that would be my general guidance on that. There were some questions about transparency and publication of names. We're not going to do that, but we will publish the province of where the clinical experts practice and their specialties. So that will improve some transparency in the system. And then as far as patient groups providing a list of names, that is something that Michelle will talk to you later about how we are evolving our patient and clinician input process. And so as that work progresses, I think this is one area that could be of great interest for us to look at going forward. But for now, we're keeping it to sponsors. For proposed reimbursement criteria and conditions, so it's actually something we've already allowed. We typically ask sponsors for their reimbursement ask and criteria, but we are now asking for more versus status quo. So the question we received during feedback is just asking for some clarity on the level of detail. So wanted to remind sponsors that participation is voluntary, so you don't need to submit the criteria conditions. Sort of a value add, we think. And we're particularly looking for initiation, renewal, discontinuation, and prescribing information. So you'll notice pricing, for example, is not something we're looking for, so that's not something you would have to worry about providing. Okay. Indirect comparisons. So what we proposed by default is that we would typically allow sponsors to submit one type of indirect comparison for any combination of population, comparator, or endpoint. And what we heard was that, well, allowing multiple comparisons with different methods may mitigate uncertainty in some cases. So we do allow multiple methods within our complex review process, so that holds true. And we've made a change that we will allow an anchored matching adjusted indirect comparison, or an anchored make. We might accept that in addition to another indirect comparison for PACES reviews. So that feedback did change where we landed, and so that we will provide, or we will accept that. I would just say when it comes to submission components, particularly around indirect comparisons where sponsors are generating these, you can generate a lot of different types. These are good conversations to have at pre-submission meetings with us, so that you can sort of talk us through the rationale, and we can provide you with some guidance in terms of whether we think it's necessary or not. So that's sort of the take-home message from indirect comparisons as well, is it's a good conversation to have early in a pre-submission phase. All right, so that does it for submission components. So now we're going to move over to talking about PACES a bit. So screening of PACES. So what we proposed is that sponsors have the option of submitting any file as a tailored review through PACES, standard review, or complex review. We will just assess eligibility. So we will not triage the file into one of those three. So what we heard was, well, if you accept the file as a PACES review, does that mean that you do deem these drugs comparable? And so the answer to that is no. Just because we accept a file for PACES does not mean that we have deemed them to be comparable beforehand. We don't do an appraisal beforehand. We just look at the submission components to see whether we think you have met the requirements to be able to make a case for comparability. And that's where our review team and then the committee would make an assessment and make a recommendation based on the clinical evidence. So, just because we accept a file for PACES does not necessarily mean or imply that they are comparable. That is a question that has to be answered still. Eligibility criteria. So this is around the claim of clinical benefit that I alluded to earlier. I think there was some reluctance around the language. And so, and there were some suggestions for how to change the language, which we did entertain. But when we went back and forth on it, we felt that we wanted to try to use as much plain language as we could. But what we also want to stress is not making a clinical claim does not imply that the sponsor does not support the drug satisfies an unmet need. It may indeed address an unmet need, and it may indeed be a superior drug, and you may have evidence to support that. The challenge with some of this is the uncertainty in the evidence. If the evidence package you have in front of you, you feel may not be compelling enough for a committee, the expert committee, to sort of support a claim of clinical benefit, then it doesn't speak to whether the drug has a benefit or not. It just speaks to the evidence package itself. And so we appreciate that, as a commercial entity and having a marketing team behind you, applying for a process for comparable drugs might be something that could be discouraging. But we want to emphasize that this is really intended for simple, lower risk files. And there is a benefit, hopefully, in terms of timelines, which we've talked about, and that benefit we hope should exceed any challenge you have with the wording. The subcommittee process, that's part of PACES. Part of the reason why we're able to do this a bit faster is we don't have to wait for a monthly meeting. We did propose, though, that when the subcommittee provides a recommendation, we would validate it by the full committee. But what we heard, actually quite broadly from most external parties, was that step is probably redundant and may not be a good use of time. It would actually delay the process potentially. So where we landed is that the subcommittee's recommendation will just move forward in a consent agenda later on and won't require validation. The exception to that is if consensus is not reached at the subcommittee. If the chair feels that there's a need for a broader discussion, then it might be brought to the full committee. But generally, it won't be, and that should really help us achieve those timelines we've talked about. For additional data, so PACES reviews, we've outlined in a table what's in scope for the review, which is fairly limited to the evidence, the clinical evidence and the indirect comparisons. What we heard, though, is sponsors have said, well, maybe we have some supplementary evidence, some real-world evidence, for example, or a long-term extension study that should be heard by the expert committee. And what we've said is, PACES reviews are streamlined. They're meant to be faster. So we will not accept those for PACES. But if the sponsor feels very strongly about that supplementary evidence, they can submit it, but the review would have to go through a standard or a complex review. So it wouldn't be eligible for PACES at that point. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Okay. Accelerated access pathways. And I swear I'm not the only one talking. Michelle, I'm going to pass it to Michelle soon, but I have a few more of these topics to go through. Expansion of the TLR pathway or time-limited recommendations. So what we proposed is a pretty modest expansion to resubmission for files that received a previous do not reimburse that would have been eligible for our criteria. And then what we heard overwhelmingly is we should expand this to much further or much more beyond the scope of what we've initially put forward. And so where we've landed is we still feel like we need to assess the TLR pilot, which said we needed to see 3 to 5 of these drugs go through to really get a sense of what the learnings were. And so that's still our goal, but we are listening and open to proposals to see how we can expand the pilot if there's a compelling case. So not to say that the door is shut on expanding the pilot, but our plan is to still make sure that assessment of TLR is going forward. Similarly to expansion of rolling reviews, so we provided more guidance on the rolling review pilot, which generally says we'll accept economic components around 20 business days later from the clinical components. And what we heard is sponsors would like the flexibility to submit new evidence right up until the day before the expert committee meeting, which, sort of a late breaking thing. We joked about, leaving an abstract under the windshield wiper of our car, kind of like last second opportunity. And as much as we would like to do that, there obviously are challenges with being able to critically appraise evidence so late in the process. So we'd like to see how the current pilot goes by doing this again for quite a bit of time, and then looking to see what opportunities there are to expansion. So we're not going to change rolling reviews at this moment. checkpoint meetings and deliberations. So for pre-submission meetings and evidence presentation meetings, by having more meetings, we wanted to sort of limit or define the scope, have them a bit shorter, but also try to limit the attendance in those meetings, particularly around external clinical experts, because we find that the discussions are quite good, but they do take some time. So we wanted to limit clinical experts to just the evidence presentation meetings, not the pre-sub meetings. But what we heard from sponsors was that, there probably are instances where clinical experts might really help us in the pre-sub meeting context, particularly around what the place in therapy is or what relevant comparators are. So we agreed, and we've now said that we will allow clinical experts to come to the pre-sub meeting. We would just ask that sort of you run it by with us when you book the meeting and provide us with a rationale of why you're bringing them. We don't want to waste their time as well if they aren't necessarily needed at that juncture. We definitely want to hear from them at the evidence presentation meetings, though. That'll continue. The recommendation pathway. So this is a bit of a meaty one. So we published the deliberative framework, which has 5 domains. And, there's been a lot of thought and a lot of time that's gone into putting that together. The biggest question we got sort of universally was, well, how does the deliberative framework sort of work? What is the relationship between these domains, between each other, and how is the committee going to use this? So where we landed on this was we actually came up with a pathway for the clinical experts, which we didn't publish during consultation, but now we've published it in the appendix of the deliberative framework document. And if you aren't sure where to find that document, we are actually going to be posting a link to it in the chat. And so you'll see it's Appendix 1 of that document. And so the next slide actually has the visual of it. And so fully appreciate it's a very busy slide. There's a lot of text on here. And so I'll walk you through a crash course of it, but please refer to the link that's posted in the chat. You can go and take a look at it in a bit more depth later. But generally, what you would see is starting from the top, so through questions 1, 2, and 3, we've ordered the deliberative framework domains, which you see in the blue boxes, sort of in this order. And this is the way that the committees will be ordering their discussion. So the first conversation is all about clinical value. So is there clinical value versus appropriate comparators? If the answer to that question is yes, then you move on to the right and you go towards a reimbursement recommendation. If it's a no, generally you go to do not reimburse. If it's uncertain, which I think probably the majority of files would likely fall under, the next set of questions are around unmet clinical need. So is there a significant need, and what's our level of certainty in the clinical value? Again, if it's a yes, there's a high certainty of an unmet need. With uncertain clinical value, you can move over to the right. If it's no or uncertain, you go to the third question. And the third question is all about, if you see to the left, distinct social and ethical considerations. So if we're not sure about the clinical value, we're not sure about the unmet need, the next question is, does this drug address a significant unmet non-clinical need or health inequity? If yes, then we move to the right. If no, then it moves to do not reimburse. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is on the economic side, you'll see it's on the right side. Economic considerations are brought in after, on the left side, you've moved over to a yes. And all that does is reiterate that an ICER, or cost effectiveness ratio, does not dictate a do not reimburse recommendation. It's something we've always talked about, but I think visually now it spells this out much clearer. Our intent when we post our recommendations going forward is that for each drug, we will show you how the committee went through this pathway. So you'll have, there'll be summarized responses or discussion points for these domains. And so you'll be able to see how the committee went from questions 1, 2, 3 as appropriate. Okay, so again, appreciate that this is there's a lot here. So please follow the link and we can talk a little bit more at the Q&A if need be, or we can certainly provide more guidance if there are questions in the future. The last point around deliberations was around transparency. And so what we proposed is we'll publish vote counts, we'll summarize dissenting opinions, and we'll post the rec pathway for each review. So what we heard is, there's still a desire to have more transparency. So access to committee members, access to asking questions to our expert committee members, transcripts of the deliberations. So again, we are looking to be more transparent as we go over time. We think a lot of what we've proposed should address a lot of the questions, and we think the recommendation pathway, which we will include in each of the reports, will provide a level of transparency that we haven't done before, and enough to probably satisfy a lot of what folks are looking for. Obviously, we'll see, and we'll be curious to get your feedback in the future after you've had a chance to see this process roll out. And then the last section for me before I pass it to Michelle is for complex reviews. So what we proposed for scenario 1, so scenario 1 complex reviews are limited to first-in-class drugs in a therapeutic area. So what we heard was, what do you mean by therapeutic area? Which is a fair question. So we provided a bit more guidance in terms of how we distinguish a therapeutic area. So in the blue box on the right, we have an example. This is most likely to come up in oncology, where you have multiple lines of therapy. The first drug that's indicated for the target type of cancer would be considered first class, but not for subsequent submissions that follow in different lines of therapy. So if a drug is targeting a tumor for the first time in third line, that would mean it's first in class. If it then moves to second line and it's the first one in second line, that's not necessarily what we'd consider a first in class under scenario 1. So we hope that provides some clarity for everyone. For scenario 2, these are for drugs that are high priority that just don't happen to be first in class. And so to define that, we thought we would look at the priority reviews from Health Canada. So anything that would go through Health Canada as a priority review, we would consider a scenario 2 complex review. And we got some good feedback on that, and that in some therapeutic areas, especially rare diseases, priority reviews may not be possible. So the suggestion that came from some patient groups was you should probably look at an NOCC designation as well. And so we've listened and we've done that. So now scenario 2 complex reviews not only include priority reviews from Health Canada, but also files that are designated with an NOCC. Societal perspective as a process enhancement. So we proposed applying the societal perspective to scenario 1 complex reviews. And what we heard was there's a desire sort of universally to see societal perspective more broadly. So when we took this back internally, we thought, well, maybe we're jumping the gun a little bit with applying societal perspective within PR renewal. Our health economics team is conducting a pilot for societal perspective that should conclude in July of this year. And we thought, why don't we wait for that pilot to conclude and assess what we've learned and then decide where we think societal perspective should be applied. So that's where we landed. So we won't be using it for scenario 1 complex reviews. We'll keep the same definition from the pilot until July, and then we'll update everyone on where societal perspective will go from there. Okay. So with that, my section is done, but before I pass it on to Michelle, we thought because there's so much content here, we might split up some of the Q&A. So Sam, I think I pass this back to you, right?
Exactly, yeah, but hang tight because you won't be going far.
That's
We
okay.
have a number of questions
Okay.
submitted. So one of the first ones, just an easy one for you, Peter. Will the received feedback submissions be published by CDA AMC?
The feedback for this consultation?
Yeah, the February 6th feedback.
It's a great question, but the answer is no. We typically don't publish the feedback that we receive on process changes. It's just been a historical thing that we've never done. And so we wouldn't be able to do that on this one because we would want to get consent sort of before we asked for the feedback anyways. If that is something that external folks think that would be important for the future, I think that's something we can look to doing. But for this one, no, we did not intend to publish that the feedback we received.
Thank you, Peter. Now, for manufacturers interested in submitting a PACES review after
Mhm.
April 28th, 2025,
Mhm.
can the eligibility form be sent now?
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
But please feel free to engage us right away. Like I said, there's been a couple of manufacturers that have done so already. So now that the procedures are out, I mean, I appreciate it would be difficult to do this until you were able to see the procedures and see the eligibility form. But as of last Thursday, the form is published online, so we are accepting it.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Peter. Another question for you. So if the CDA AMC is not triaging review types, does that mean
Mhm.
that if a sponsor submits a file as a standard review, Canada's drug agency could not determine that it should be a tailored review during the screening period? Is that the same for complex reviews? So for an example, if a
Okay.
sponsor submits a file as a standard review, but the
Mhm.
CDA AMC determines that it meets the eligibility criteria for a complex review,
Mhm.
CDA AMC would still review the file as a standard review?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So ultimately, we will deem or provide eligibility, and a sponsor we will review a file so long as it is eligible for one of those three review types, but we will not dictate which review type it is. So if a sponsor has a file that could be eligible for a complex review, but chooses to submit it as a standard review, that is their decision. We will accept it. Obviously, the submission requirements are a little bit different, and there's not as many process enhancements, but also comes with a smaller fee. So that is the decision of the manufacturer. And same thing with files that are PACES reviews or eligible for PACES reviews. If a manufacturer feels that they still wish to move forward with a standard review, that is completely their purview. We will let them know generally if we think that it might be eligible for another review type and they are pursuing something else, but it's up to the manufacturer's discretion.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. And just in the interest of time, maybe we have time for one more question, and then we can try and circle back at the end to see if there's any additional questions that we can throw back at you. But one of the last question for now is just, would a clinical expert who supports a sponsor's submission at meetings not be eligible to be an expert for the committee, for example, per CDEC or for a competitor's file?
So sorry, if they're a clinical expert for meetings, which meetings?
Who supports a sponsor's submission, um,
Oh,
would they be eligible to also be an expert for the committee meeting?
yeah, right. So I did say that there's some exceptions. That's generally the one we would look to when I think of someone who should be excluded. So if, for example, you've run an advisory board to try to get advice specifically on a submission to CDA, and you've contracted a clinical expert, and they've helped you put that submission dossier together or advised you on that dossier, um, we would deem that as a relevant conflict to not be then part of the CDA review. So we would certainly ask that those clinicians disclose those conflicts, and that would likely lead to them not being included.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. So with that, we'll move over to Michelle Gibbens, our Director of Engagement, who's going to speak to the persons with lived experience presentations.
Thanks, Sam. And pleased to have the opportunity to update you on this particular aspect of the changes. This was an enhancement, you may recall, an enhancement to patient involvement that we've been testing and developing over the last couple of years with the Formulary Management Expert Committee. And the proposal was that we were looking to expand this into the Canadian Drug Expert Committee and Pan-Canadian Oncology Expert Review Committee. And this involves a presentation from the person with lived experience to the deliberative committee at the beginning of their deliberative meeting for the product under review. Next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. So first of all, again, similar to comments that Suda and Peter made previously, really appreciate all of the feedback that we did receive. We received a considerable amount of feedback around the persons with lived experience presentations that we carefully considered, lots of thoughtful feedback, and really appreciated. So happy to share, some of what we heard and where we're headed as a result. One of the areas where we received a considerable amount of feedback was the type of reimbursement reviews for which persons with lived experience presentations would occur. What we had proposed is that it would be applicable to complex review scenarios that Peter had outlined previously, so to a subset of files. The feedback that we received was asking us to consider broader application of the opportunity for persons with lived experience presentations to the deliberative committee for either all standard reviews or at least consideration for specific conditions where there might be some unique aspects or special considerations that could benefit from this type of the committee having the opportunity to have this type of presentation. In line with what Suda said, we have decided that this is where we will start with what we had originally proposed, moving forward with the subset of files for those complex reviews that were specified only. We do have some experience in testing and developing this process and of working with persons with lived experience around these presentations with the Formulary Management Expert Committee, but this is an additional change for the two additional committees that we're introducing, and we feel like this is the best place for us to start. We want to be mindful as we approach this this change that we are ensuring that our engagement is meaningful, impactful on the committee's deliberation, and also that we are able to provide the appropriate preparation, guidance, and support to those persons with lived experience who are presenting. And this was another aspect of feedback that we heard through the consultation, as well as through those who have experienced this opportunity through the Formulary Management Expert Committee to this point, about how important providing that appropriate guidance and support is. So we feel like this is the best way for us to move forward at this point to ensure, and we'll continue to learn and improve as we go, and consider if there are next steps beyond that as we learn further with these two additional expert committees. Next slide, please. We had indicated that we would seek to engage a person with experience in the condition under review, and clarified that to be a patient, caregiver, or family member. Some of the feedback that we had was encouraging us to consider the need for multiple persons with lived experience to present, to ensure that there was a diversity of perspectives. And while we do understand that, one individual presenting their experience and perspectives is not going to be reflective of all patients, we have decided to proceed, with continuing as we have been with FMEC, to have one person with lived experience presenting for the complex review scenarios that have been identified. And, one of our, key considerations in this is, and I'll speak more to this in a moment, is that the persons with lived experience presentation is really to be a supplement and a complementary source of patient involvement or patient perspective to the patient group input process that remains in place, and so the persons with lived experience presentation doesn't replace that. So the patient group input does provide that range of experiences and perspectives, while the persons with lived experience presentation is really intended to be that opportunity for a narrative on the individual's journey and opportunity to interact with the committee around their specific experiences, but not replacing broader perspectives through the patient group input process. Next slide, please. We also had some feedback, mixed feedback in different directions, but very helpful to help us revisit and consider how we move forward with the recruitment criteria for the persons with lived experience selected to present. In the selection criteria that we had initially identified, we had indicated that ideally we would, start with looking for someone who has experience with a drug under review. Some of the feedback we received indicated, yes, that it should be what we're doing. That's very important. Other aspects of the feedback actually, identified challenges and suggested that it may not be appropriate to prioritize seeking somebody with experience with a drug under review. And part of what we heard about is, number one, as we move from the formulary management expert committee reviews, which are typically with drugs later in their life cycle, to drugs that are newly coming into Canada, the more limited potential of identifying folks who have had experience with the drug, and so challenges in being able to identify people to participate, and also some comments about the fact that the people that if we were to find someone, that their experience would have been limited to a clinical trial environment that may not actually be reflective of standard of care in real life environments, and so broader experience may be important to consider. So that we took that varied feedback into account and have decided to move the required criteria around experience with the drug under review and focus only on a priority focus on finding individuals with lived experience who can share their experience and perspectives on the indication or condition under review. This certainly, does not limit individuals from speaking to their treatment experiences, including if they happen to have had treatment experiences with the treatment under review. But we, know from feedback from the expert committee members that information perspective on their experience with the disease and the condition and the realities of living with it is actually some of the most impactful information from these presentations. So that certainly informed this decision as well. Next slide, please. Our language that we initially proposed around how we would engage is that we would endeavor to engage a person with lived experience for every complex review that meets those criteria, but indicated that it may not always be possible. This led to questions and really helpful feedback about, so what happens if a person's with lived experience cannot be found to present, and wanting to be sure that it wasn't we would decide whether we would engage, but that we would, in every case where the applicable criteria were relevant, that we would be attempting to engage. And so we've just simply clarified that we will being very explicit about the fact that we will make every effort to engage, and also if a person with lived experience is not found for a review, or if for some reason someone who is planning to present on a particular day at a particular committee meeting cannot attend due to unforeseen circumstances, the committee meeting will proceed as scheduled, so that the file wouldn't be deferred, to the next committee meeting, we would proceed. And again, appreciating that the committee would still have information on patient perspectives and experiences from the patient group input submissions to be considered in the deliberation. So it wouldn't be that the case that there would not be patient input to inform the deliberation. There still would be. So next slide, please. I've alluded to this a little bit in some of the comments that I've made already. You know, in the original consultation document, we, you know, mentioned that the persons with lived experience presentations are to be supplementary to patient group input, and you know, clarifying a little bit the distinction of that. But the feedback highlighted the need to further clarify that. So we have, you know, attempted to, in the updated procedures document, clarify further the distinct roles and supplementary nature of patient group input and persons with lived experience presentations. And as you know, in a few moments, I'll talk about where we're going next in terms of looking at patient group input processes and evolving those. And you know, we will certainly take that, all aspects of patient input into consideration in how we define that further moving forward. So next slide, please. Okay. So further to how we, you know, select, or the criteria that we consider as for persons with lived experience presentations, initially, you know, we did not include any selection criteria should we have a situation where multiple individuals were interested and available to present. The scenario that scenario has actually not emerged in the Formulary Management Expert Committee experience. We have not encountered a situation where there were multiple groups or individuals interested in you know, identifying someone to present or themselves present. But it was very helpful to hear that, yes, that is a scenario that we should potentially anticipate going forward. At the same time, you know, we had quite a lot of feedback about the need to ensure that we're hearing from diverse voices and diverse perspectives through these presentations to the expert committee. So the combination of those feedback, those aspects of feedback, we've are now moving forward with, if there is a situation where multiple individuals are interested in presenting, that we would prioritize the inclusion of underrepresented or underserved populations in the selection process. Our decision on that front was also further enhanced by our you know, organizational commitments to inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and Indigenous reconciliation. If there were opportunities for us to amplify those voices through this process, that we would seek the opportunity to do that. Next slide, please. I referenced earlier the definition of a person's with lived experience, and what we had proposed was certainly that, you know, engaging with a person with lived experience, a patient, caregiver, or family member. Again, this was a place where we had some, you know, feedback in some different directions, some different suggestions or considerations for us. Some emphasize that we should be really only hearing from patient only. Others emphasize that in particular, you know, in some situations that, you know, a caregiver presenting, you know, may be relevant. And then others emphasize the need to be more inclusive in who we would consider to present and or attend to support a person with a lived experience. We carefully considered all of that feedback and expanded the definition to explicitly say that we include patients, caregivers, close supports, family members, to ensure that we're inclusive of, you know, and taking into consideration the diversity of support networks that a patient may have. Just noting that in our experience with the Formulary Management Expert Committee, and it would be our intention carrying forward as well, that caregivers have sometimes presented alongside, caregivers or family members or close supports have sometimes presented alongside patients, and that we would also, you know, continue to welcome that as we move this forward into the additional review types with CDEC and PERC. Next slide, please. We had lots of very helpful feedback around the need for us to consider supports, accommodations, and you know how we prepare individuals for the experience of presenting at the expert committees. We had provided some general, fairly high-level information about the fact that we do provide some guidance and leading up to the presentation, and emotional support following if that is something that the individual is interested in. So lots of what we heard was about, like, how do we standardize that? What resources are we providing? What does the support look like? Clearly pointing for a need for us to provide more detail and description about what we have been doing and intend to continue to do as we move forward with the having these presentations for complex reviews at the Canadian Drug Expert Committee and Pan-Canadian Oncology Expert Review Committee. So that is, you know, we have added that clarity in the procedures document. Hopefully that will be helpful. And also, you know, really pointing out that we hadn't made any notation about how we would accommodate the needs of individuals with lived experience. This is something that we have been doing in the context of the Formulary Management Expert Committee experience, and it is very much our intention that it would carry forward. So we just added that clarity in the procedures document that is in fact part of our process, that we want to ensure meaningful participation, and we will look to support accommodations necessary to do that. And just to give a sense of what that has looked like, just a couple of examples from our experience with these presentations to date has included pre-recorded presentation, because that was a more comfortable and feasible way for the person to participate and then respond to questions. Written statements read on behalf of the patient by somebody else, and you know, that's just a couple of examples, but we're very open to accommodating what will work best so that we can hear, you know, meaningful participation from a wide range of voices through this process. Next slide, please. We had indicated that we will offer an optional honoraria for persons with lived experience who are presenting to expert committees. We have been doing this with the Formulary Management Expert Committee. And, you know, some of the feedback just, you know, simply highlighted the need to make sure that there's appropriate compensation. So as part of that, our process, as we look to move, you know, beyond this initial pilot experience with the Formulary Management Expert Committee, we're doing some analysis to look at the time commitment that has been involved for persons with lived experience, and you know, reviewing our honoraria practice to make sure that what we're offering in terms of a level of honoraria is appropriate, and you know, we'll update our practice accordingly once we've completed that review. Next slide, please. Our current practice with the Formulary Management Expert Committee has, for the, you know, the engagement officer that has been supporting the process, has sought, you know, qualitative feedback on the experience, and relatively informally at different touch points during the process with those who participated. You know, and we have examples of, you know, feedback that have been provided verbally and or, you know, via email or in writing. The feedback that we received through the consultation process really encouraged us to look at having a formal feedback mechanism so that we could have the opportunity to learn and improve. And we agree that's a really important thing to be considering. And we are in the process of developing that formal feedback mechanism, and that will be implemented as part of how we move forward with this. We're very interested in continuous improvement and learning on this, and committed to doing that. And this, you know, feedback mechanism will support us to be able to do that. All right, next slide, please. So that is the changes that are moving forward now. If you tuned in or listened to the recording of the webinar from December, I mentioned then, and reiterating now, that, you know, as Suda said, we're on a journey here, and the next step on our journey is to focus on evolving the patient and clinician group input process for reimbursement reviews. We have heard a lot of feedback over time and acknowledged that there was actually a lot of feedback provided during this consultation process that went beyond looking at the persons with lived experience or the, deliberative framework, but, led to questions about how do we evolve and, concerns or areas for improvement around particularly patient group inputs, but also clinician group input. And, we're not going to focus on that today, but we have absolutely made note of all of that and appreciate all of that feedback, as well as feedback that we've received over time. And we'll be taking that forward into an initiative that we're about to launch to look at how we evolve patient and clinician group input. Thank you for taking the time to add that into this current consultation feedback provided. We are certainly considering that as we move forward. We're currently in the process of, we recognize that we want to have a very thorough engagement process. There are a lot of groups that contribute patient and clinician group input. There's others that may want to. We want to have a thorough engagement process as we look at changes. Because we've heard from folks over time about the effort and resources required to participate in our process. So we want to look at how we can perhaps make that, address some of those concerns, aligned with what Peter shared before about some of the things that we hope that will increase transparency. We feel like there's opportunities that as we align and focus, if we evolve to align and focus the patient and clinician group input with the refreshed deliberative framework and the recommendation pathway, et cetera, that's available now, that we, there's opportunities to improve things along that line too. So as I said, we're in the midst of planning that engagement process, and we'll have additional information to share in the not too distant future as we initiate this next aspect of work, and look forward to engaging with many of you or all of you on that as we move forward in the coming weeks and months. And I think with that, we're on to questions and answers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was great to hear. We have a number of questions coming in already. And if we have time, we can always circle back to a few extra questions for Peter as well, just because we've had a significant amount of responses. So Michelle, the first question is just, are you able to share how we currently identify or find patients or people with lived experience to participate?
Okay, yes. So currently we work with patient and most often working with patient and clinician groups to identify persons with lived experience to present, and anticipate that we will move forward in a similar manner. Recognize that we did receive feedback about some other opportunities, some other ways to consider, and we will be looking at that again as we look at patient input holistically. One of the things that I think this consultation process really helped us to solidify is that we can't look at patient group input in isolation of persons with lived experience, and how we recruit and select for persons with lived experience, how that aligns and connects with what's happening in patient group input. So I think, we'll be looking at all aspects of patient input holistically, and how we connect and hear from diverse voices. So. Oh, Sam, I think you're muted.
You are right. I knew someone would do it, and it had to be me. Are you planning to include patient groups in the person with lived experience presentations? So maybe in brackets, they put on behalf of patients?
That is not something, we have evolved and developed over time with the Formulary Management Expert Committee, and patient group presentations on behalf of a patient or patients is not a part of the process as we anticipate it going forward. As I said, we are looking at that group input process and anticipate that will evolve over time, as we engage about how we best do that. But specifically in terms of persons with lived experience presentations, our learning to this point has been the real value of hearing directly from patients, caregivers, their close supports around their direct experiences, and not, trying to cover comprehensively.
Thank you, Michelle. And if I could add, we've had an instance where we've asked a patient group to present on behalf of the patient because of language issues. So we've had opportunities to do accommodations in that sense. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Sam.
My pleasure. The next question, Michelle, for you is, will non-Canadian people with lived experience be eligible to present to the expert committees if we're not able to find a suitable Canadian person with lived experience?
I mean that I think we're very interested in experience in the Canadian context, and you know, so I think that would certainly not be first priority. That's something maybe we can take away and consider. And certainly, you know, if there is a review for, you know, that if anyone's aware of, that there would be persons with lived experience presentation, and you know, this is a challenge. I think we would, you know, have to look at considerations at best, but we are very, you know, interested in experience in the Canadian context. So, you know, that would be a priority consideration. And I think we would have to, you know, look at how we address that if we're not able to identify someone from Canada.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sorry, I would just maybe add
Yep.
that the change around the criteria to not require, you know, to focus on experience with the condition or the indication rather than the drug under review, hopefully will make that more reasonable to find someone in Canada who might be willing and able to.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm not sure that maybe this one's for Michelle or maybe Peter as well. How do deliberative frameworks, how will they show more transparency in the deliberations to ensure equity and equality in reviewing different files of similar efficacy or indications?
Sorry, I lost my mute button there with all the screens and windows I have open. Answering questions, not shopping or anything. How will the deliberative framework
Show more transparency in the deliberations to ensure equity and equality in reviewing different files or similar efficacy/indications?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think not just in that scenario, I think the intent of the deliberative framework is to demonstrate increased transparency for all review types. You know, in your specific example about sort of similar drugs, you know, there'd be certainly a discussion around the first domain around clinical value. And so if there is high certainty that the drug under review has comparable value to other drugs that are reimbursed, that generally, as long as that has been achieved, then the committee would start to go down a reimburse or reimburse with conditions pathway. And so what that really demonstrates to you is that unmet need generally becomes more of an important discussion if there is uncertainty around the clinical value. And so what that should show is that if there is a 6th, 7th, 8th, 15th drug in a therapeutic area, so long as there is confidence and certainty in the comparability of the evidence, would not penalize having that additional option from the committee's point of view. You know, more treatment options are viewed as a positive. If there are questions around the certainty of the evidence, you know, if the committee isn't sure if the drug is comparable, perhaps it could be inferior, then unmet need becomes the next relevant conversation. And so if it is an area that has an appreciable high unmet need, then that would be a different conversation from if there's uncertainty around the clinical value and it is the 15th option.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. Now, I think this question is more for Michelle. So Michelle, will there be the option for the person with lived experience presenter to pre-record their presentation or other options that would really allow them to present earlier than the deliberation would be formally addressed in, such as the committee meeting? So they highlighted in situations where a person might have, you know, metastatic disease or a severe condition, where their health is not in a state where they'll be able to present for the deliberations. You know, what kind of accommodations are available at that stage?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that's exactly, a very, a more a scenario where we would be open to accommodations and look at what would be reasonable and possible and how we would do that. And if there's a way still, to have the opportunity for question and answer with committee members at some point, that we would look into the details of that as part of accommodating the participation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, patient safety comes first, right? The next question is just, do you plan to invite more than one person with lived experience to share their story? Several? How many do you invite? And so I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I'm not sure if you want to touch on that again.
Yeah, so in terms of the actual, presentation, we are, as I indicated, moving forward with having one presenter for any of the complex reviews, appreciating that we are getting additional patient input and perspectives through the patient group input process, and the committee is also considering that as part of the deliberative process. In terms of, I wonder if part of the question may actually be related to, do we, just approach one person? And I would say that fairly comprehensive efforts are made in generally engaging, with multiple patient or clinician groups, trying to identify, someone who has the experience with the condition under review, and our experience, with the Formulary Management Expert Committee is that it has been, it takes a lot of outreach, and we don't necessarily always have a lot of response. It is a considerable ask, and we fully appreciate that for someone to present about their personal experience with an expert committee. So I guess our outreach is comprehensive to identify someone to participate, but in the end, we will have one presenter at the deliberative meeting for that particular product, that again, if we found ourselves in a fortunate scenario of multiple people being available and interested in participating, as I indicated, our priority selection would be if someone, could speak to the experience of an underrepresented or underserviced group in relation to their experience and perspective on the treatment. So.
Thank you, Michelle. So I have another question. It might be applicable to both of you, so feel free to jump in as you please. How does it impact complex review files if there are some that are accompanied with a person with lived experience live presentation and some aren't? In a way, is not having a live presentation a piece of information shortcoming?
Well, I can maybe start, and then Peter might have additional perspective to add. Again, the persons with lived experience presentation has been an enhancement that we have developed to having patient involvement, but it's not the only path to patient involvement. So if there's not someone presenting, then we will still anticipate for reviews that we would have, those complex reviews, that we would have patient group input that would be considered by the deliberative committee. So it's not that the review is proceeding absent of the committee having the opportunity to consider patient group consider patient perspectives and experiences as part of that. So I don't know, Peter, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I can add. I mean, we've been piloting this at the FMEC committee, and so we've had a couple examples of live presentation, and I believe at least one pre-recorded that I can recall. And I don't think there's any downside to pre-recording. I think it is a difficult thing for most people to do, if not all people, to sort of stand in front of a room of strangers, mostly clinicians, and tell their life story. So I think there's pros and cons to each approach. I think part of the benefit, though, of having someone with lived experience there is to be able to answer questions of the committee. And so I think even if there's a sort of pre-recorded presentation, as much as we can have the person be there to answer questions after a video would be very beneficial.
Peter, could I just add to that? I mean, we're really taking our cue from the person with lived experience here, right? And their preference and any accommodations that they may need.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We do, certainly. And we give them the option. And I think from the FMEC piloting, actually, if anyone would know the most, it'd be Sam, because Sam has sort of led that. I think the vast majority of persons with lived experience do end up presenting live.
Absolutely, yes. But we've also had situations where either they have language barriers that they don't feel comfortable speaking in English. So we've found ways to work around that by working with patient groups to present on their behalf, but still have them there present live as well, so that we still have that interaction. Again, we've done pre-recordings as well in instances where people haven't been well and they kind of knew ahead of time maybe that they might not be well enough for that date. So we've certainly, made all attempts to accommodate as best as we can. I believe maybe we have time for one more question, and this one goes for Michelle. Michelle, you spoke about the resources needed to do outreach and identify a suitable person with lived experience. So as patient groups, we experience similar challenges when connecting Canada's drug agency with people with lived experience. Can you address how Canada's drug agency will support patient groups as we work together to identify a suitable person with lived experience?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sam. I think, again, as we work together and engage further on looking at patient input holistically, as we evolve, the patient and clinician input, this persons with lived experience presentations has been one enhancement, one change that we've tested, but we know there's potential opportunities for more, and certainly mindful of demands on patient groups and how we best support and how we best advance that. Certainly some of the feedback, that we've heard over time is, things around, the timelines. And so one of the ways that we do that around the persons with lived experience presentations is trying to do that outreach and engagement at the very, very early stage. Which ends up being actually, depending on how quickly the connection happens, but ends up being a few months in advance of the actual committee meeting, so that there's time to consider and process that. We do, have an engagement officer assigned to each review that will have a persons with lived experience presentation, and they're available to, provide support and guidance to both the persons with lived experience, as well as engaging, and providing similar support and guidance to patient and clinician groups who are willing to, collaborate with us on the identification of someone who might be able and willing to present to the committee.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. And I think just the final question for the day is, will there be some training or education for the expert committee members regarding the interactions with the person with lived experience? And I'm happy to jump in if you need to.
Yeah. No. The reason Sam is saying that is actually we just started that process at a recent meeting of the expert committees, where we had all three expert committees, so the Formulary Management Expert Committee, the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Expert Review Committee together. So Sam was able to provide some orientation and training to the committees that will be new to this process, as well as the Formulary Management Expert Committee members were able to share about their experiences and their learning from having been involved in testing and developing the persons with lived experience process. So and certainly training in terms of approaching questioning of questions of persons with lived experience presenters in an appropriate and respectful manner, and related kinds of considerations were part of what was discussed with the committees as well. Preparing them for that, and it was really valuable, I think, to have colleague expert committee members from another committee sharing with the other committees their learning and experience from having had the opportunity to work with and experience the persons with lived experience presentations for some time now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle. I know we're nearing time, so maybe we can move on to the next slide. So thank you both so much for the presentations today. Thank you, Suda. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to our audience for joining us and learning more about the Pharmaceutical Reviews Renewal Initiative here at Canada's Drug Agency. We appreciate the time and effort that you've provided in submitting your feedback and attending today as well. Merci à tous pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Nous apprécions le temps que vous avez pris pour nous joindre et nous sommes heureux de voir tellement d'intérêt dans ce travail. Just please visit our website to sign up for the weekly updates if you haven't already done so. There you'll get notifications of future engagement events or different engagement opportunities, as well as upcoming reimbursement reviews. Again, the recording will be found on YouTube and it will be shared with all those registered along with the slides, and we'll also include a link to the document that we promised we'd put in the chat that unfortunately we didn't realize we couldn't add, so we'll add that to that email as well. There is a post-event survey that you can click on the checkmark icon at the top of your screen. So we invite you to provide any feedback on this session if you can. But lastly, thank you all again for engaging with us. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find our details here, or our request email is the best way to get a hold of us if you have any further questions following this webinar. So with that, I think we can wrap this up. So wishing you all a wonderful day and take care.